Soon the tribe's hierarchy was obvious. One man alone became actively ignored, peered at only with the corners of eyes. "Ah, there you are," Ruka thought. "Chief of the Pits." This chief was older than most. He was well-groomed, with the stature of a man who once liked to fight, but now liked to eat. The crowd tried to watch him without watching. They seemed worried, but some at least looked amused, almost pleased. Perhaps these were his enemies or rivals. From the moment he had entered the room, Ruka had begun to practice throwing a club in his grove. He moved a target and tried again and again in the training field he had laboured in since he was a boy. The pit above him had no railing, and the distance was short. Men began shouting at the other prisoner, who had scurried back to his side and huddled on the ground. Ruka waited for the chaos to grow. "Be ready, brother," he whispered in his mind. "Your moment is soon." The crowd kept up its calling in harsh tones, others turning to one another and laughing, perhaps to soothe the mounting tension. At last the chief spoke, and all eyes turned to him. "Now!" Bukieg launched the weapon hard at a smiling man closest to the edge. It was not a tool designed to be thrown, and its flight was awkward, but it struck. It hit the man in the gut, and no doubt did little damage. But damage was not the intent. The terrified watcher startled in surprise. He jostled his neighbours, who themselves panicked as he stumbled against them. They knocked him forward, the only place they could push, and he lost his footing. With a wild, useless flail, he fell into the pit. The crowd cried out in horror, and Ruka paced forward in measured steps. He knew the door behind him was complex. It had several latches and required a key, and would take the guards far too long to open. None of the fine-smelling, fine-dressed watchers carried weapons, at least nothing except perhaps knives small enough to be hidden. He did not think they had the skill or the instinct to throw what they could down to intervene. The smiler moaned and turned over to his back. He held his wrist as if he had broken it in the fall, and his face was bloody from where it bounced off the stone. But he was very much alive. With one hand, Ruka reached down and lifted him by his neck, amused at the slight weight. He was heavier than law-speaker Bodil, perhaps, but not by much, and would surely crush as easily. The guards had entered now with swords drawn, but waited across the pit. Perhaps they waited for orders, or perhaps from fear of the big white demon. But it made no difference. Ruka looked up and waited for the chief's eyes. "This is for you," he meant to say. "I am a killer, but I am not mindless. I can be useful." He squeezed until the flesh of Smiler's neck shrunk, until the harder structure inside crushed and popped to half the size it should be. Then he dropped the poor man to suffocate on the ground, and started on his grave in his grove. All the while the crowd gasped and shrieked. Many covered their mouths in horror, though some few of the men still looked pleased. The dying man writhed and squirmed on the ground, his mouth leaking blood as he made his last desperate strangled sounds. Ruka felt a sudden anger at the reaction above. "Why do you recoil?" he wanted to scream. "Isn't this what you came for? A dead man in a pit?" They cared now only because the man who died was one of them, a few moments ago powerful and untouchable by vermin in a pit. But we are none of us safe, Ruka wanted to tell them, a hard lesson learned well in the wilds as an outcast. Death was always but a moment of surprise from life. Such was the nature of things. But he didn't yet know their words, and in any case his point to the king had been made. He put his hands out and knelt, hoping the guards didn't beat him to death.